Okay, so this is continuing our presentation on strategic HRM. Today, or this video, we're going to look at best practice HR. So, in a nutshell, best practice is one size fits all, that we can identify the internal and external factors which all combined together will deliver high performance within an organisation. There are within that, when you read your book, you'll see there are various models which will all be classified as best practice. So there's not a universal, this is one model. There are variations between the models. I'll leave you to look at those. The purpose of this video is to allow you to understand what best practice is, and therefore when you come to an exam, if you're asked to do a comparison between best practice and best fit, for example, you will be able to do that. So, as I said, there are various models and they all believe that there is a set of factors, conditions within the organisation and externally, and that we can identify what are called a bundle of HR practices, which if we use all of the elements that are in the bundle of HR practices, it will give us competitive advantage. It will drive high organisational performance. What's key is that the argument is for companies to be successful, to gain competitive advantage, they have to apply all the elements of the model, and they have to use everything that's in the HR bundle of practices. So the key thing for best practice is that it is argued that it can be duplicated and copied in all organisations, and that the results will be duplicated as well. Some of the criticisms of this would be that if all organisations are doing the same thing, does that mean competitive advantage gets lost? Because they're not any better than the competition because they're all doing the same thing. That's kind of what we see when companies start copying each other and start doing what the competition are doing. They are basically applying best practice. So all the models within best practice focus on the same key things. They're looking to achieve high performance or high levels of commitment from the workers or high levels of involvement. And it's argued that all of these will deliver competitive advantage. The key thing with best practice, key thing with any business strategy is that you are trying to achieve competitive advantage. So that should always be a key driver when you're thinking about the strategy. It's about giving competitive advantage to the organisation. So when you're writing exam questions, when you're doing your assignments, you should always be focused on how does this help the business achieve its strategy? How does this add value to the organisation? Sometimes you will get questions that ask you to talk about how does this add value. So irrespective of the terminology, whether we're looking at competitive advantage, adding value, we're always thinking about the same kind of things. Okay, so as I said, there are various different models. Most of these are dating back to the 1980s, 1990s, which is really when HR, distinct from personnel management, started to emerge. Business operating environment was becoming more complex, and the need for better management of people and to get the most out of them so that we can add competitive advantage started to come to the forefront, that it was something people were thinking about. So in terms of the different models, there are some commonalities. The need to understand your organisation and its operating environment is consistent across all of the models. So it's not just about HR, it's not just about the bundles of HR practice, it's about having an understanding of your organisation, the sector it's operating in, but also what's happening internally, what's happening within the different departments, how the different departments work together, collaborate or don't. All of these things need to be looked at when you're looking at best practice. need to consider the needs of the various stakeholder groups, so employees, customers, shareholders if you're a limited company, banks, anybody that's got an interest in the company. There needs to be two-way communication. That obviously links in with things like high involvement, but there seems to be only one version of best practice where you're looking at actually having employee voice, so it's more communication, dissemination of information to employees, but having some involvement, but not necessarily a lot of participation. And most models will focus on the basic HR practices: recruitment and selection, training and development, reward, performance management. Again, some of the argument is that there are elements of best practice in general HR practice across the board now. We have a standard idea of what good recruitment and selection looks like. For example, what one of the shifts CAPD is quite keen on is that when you're writing about good practice in an organisation, you don't use best practice anymore, you use good practice, because here we're talking about a universal approach where best practice is what works, because you can take a recruitment and selection policy, and however that is structured, whatever you're doing within recruitment and selection, you should be doing the same thing in every single company. As we'll see when we go on to look at best fit, that's not necessarily always the case. You have to think about the size of the organisation, the sector you're operating in. Would something that works in the private sector necessarily work in the voluntary sector or the public sector, for example? So there may be different examples of best practice. So we call that good practice because there's more than one example. There's not one best way, but obviously best practice, the idea is that there is one best way. So, you can see how there might be criticisms of this model because of that. Okay, I'll come back with a separate video to look at contingent or best fit HR.